Hi, it's Chris from Airwindows, and I have a plugin for you this week. Well, technically, I have two. And the reason is, what I've got for you today is the newest version of Console. Now, I've made many versions of Console. It's my digital two-bus replacement system. And it's very, very simple. It does a very soft distortion curve on all of the channels, and then a anti-distortion curve on the bus. This causes things that are just coming straight through to be unaltered, so it doesn't change the tone for individual sounds that are just playing all by themselves, but when stuff combines together, it takes the combination of the sounds and tends to set it back in the soundstage so that things kind of settle into place. I've also got a different track than the usual one, which I don't think I'm going to keep because this is just a sort of jam. But I can show you what Console does with some new recordings, including like some new drum sounds and things. As such. So this is my little progressive rock setup, and I can turn on the old Purist console. You'll notice that stuff settles in a little bit more solidly. Turn it back out, and this is raw digital audio workstation. But what the new version of Console has, it's got a whole bunch of things. I feel people ought to like this one. We'll find out, I guess. Firstly, it has a different kind of algorithm for setting up its sound. Instead of using the density algorithm and the perfect opposite of that, it's doing a variation on spiral, which is cleaner as far as not making stuff sound too fat in the processing. And then it uses a custom version of that for the decode. The result is that when you go into saturation on this new version of Console, it starts bringing out harmonics in a very steady and progressive sort of way. Like it clips unusually well, even for a Console plugin. It also has a something that I've set up where, since it's if you've ever used Airwindows Density uses sine or anti-sine processing, and it can cause stuff to sound fuller and fatter and more up front, or if you use inverse density, it can make stuff kind of drop back in the soundstage. And I thought I would combine this with the way that Console works. So this new version of Console, it has a gain control on it. As you can see, if I fire one of these up, boop, and there's a fader, and then there's a master volume on the bus. The master volume goes to 1. The fader defaults to 0.772. That's because this version of Console goes from silence to unity gain, which happens to be 0.772 on this control, to boost. So we have a version of Console where you can slam the channels and make them be fatter or bigger if you want. And they will distort in a particular kind of way, and it will fit with the overall system. But it will also, as you move stuff forwards using this fader, set stuff differently with relation to the algorithm. See, if you were using the fader on a regular algorithm, which, as you might be able to see, the faders are all unity gain. If you use the fader on normal Console, like Purist Console that I've got there, it will do the opposite of what you want. It will pull back the fader, and that will make the channel be more distorted as it goes quieter. So it'll try to go a little bit fatter relatively to the output as it's getting quieter, or try to pull forwards a little bit as it's getting quieter. And if you pushed it, it would get into a more leaned out zone. So you'd get it to be spikier and louder, but it wouldn't become bigger or more up front. So it kind of, using the faders, this is why you're not supposed to use the faders, gives you sort of the opposite effect that you'd want. With this version of Console, if you're using the faders in either one of the controls, giving it more of the means causes it to be a little bigger and fatter and more forwards. Pulling it back will cause it to sit a little farther back in the soundstage. And lastly, this is after I've done a plugin called Ultrasonic, which is inspired by a Tokyo Dawn thing. It's implemented differently. And it uses 5 different biquad filters to do a really steep filter and get rid of high frequencies over 20K. Now, this project is a 96K project. I recommend people working in the modern day use 96K. You probably have enough disk space and so on for it. And this version of Console7, has built into it a variation on this ultrasonic control processing. But it's not exactly what you can still throw ultrasonic on things if you want. But what you'll hear has essentially a stage of the biquad filtering built into it at each step of the way. There's a stage of the biquad filtering before we hit the Console7 channel, before the processing happens, before the pre-distortion happens. And it's a fairly steep filter, so it'll affect the way that it hits the filter in an interesting way. It's like it gets a little bit boosty in the super highs just when it's going to start going into saturation. And then on the beginning of Console7 bus, you have a slower roll-off, a lower Q version of this, which is actually the one in front of the channel plugin, is 1.618, etc., the golden ratio. And that's slightly more resonant than you'd want, but it combines with other versions of the filter to give you a nice flat response once everything is taken care of. So you have the slightly peaky one going into the distortion, and then between the channel and the bus plugin, in other words, in the very front of the bus plugin, you have a 0.618, etc., also golden ratio, resonant biquad filter at 20K. And that's a second stage. And then after the Console7 bus, after it's been expanded backwards and the other part of the console processing has been done, you have a 0.5 resonance, which is the third part. And all of these combined together give you the same filtering cutoff as there is an isolator, which is a 5th order filter. This is not as steep as ultrasonic, but it's a lot more CPU efficient. And I honestly think that fairly often you're going to be better off with a shallower filter without as much phase shift, rather than trying to implement some insanely sharp filter, and you will hear it now. No filters or anything? This is the new version of Console. I'll turn it off. Here we have pure Daw output. And we put it back in. I've never gotten anything quite as analog feel as that. This really worked out pretty well. I really feel like it worked out pretty well. So I'm very pleased with that. But interestingly, this demonstration doesn't show you any of the stuff that I was telling you about setting it up and mixing with the controls on the actual filter. Like, for instance, let's take, first of all, let's mute some of these things. Let's mute that, let's mute this. We'll leave that in there, we'll mute this lead. Some of these synthesizer things. So now we've got a bass, a Rhodes, and a guitar. In fact, I'll kill the Rhodes too. And we'll make the guitar be mono. Now let's full width. So here's the guitar and here's the bass. It defaults to 0.772, but if I pulled the bass back using console itself, I can pull it back a hair and it sits farther back, but I can also boost it. Let's go reggaeton. What do you think of that? That's actually going into fairly heavy boosting. Because it's meant to sit here, but it comes forward while still sounding natural. So, back to the 778, 772 rather. Let's do the same thing with that guitar. Now the guitar is sitting back, but there's a kind of articulation going on, and it's sitting back in the soundstage. Whereas I can also boost it, and that will literally bring it forwards as well as making it louder. Oh, I forgot to mention, this control is also smoothed so you don't get zipper noise. And one final thing, this is the first in a series of Airwindows plugins where the dithering to floating point is initialized in such a way where each channel is going to be slightly different. Each channel will produce its own random seed, and it's then pursuing that, whereas previous ones tended to initialize the randoms with the same number, so they were producing a random seed, but it wasn't necessarily the different random for each one. Without having to do a random call for every buffer or every sample, this is still able to give all of the different channels like a different random voice. And hang on, I need to select all of these to make that work. And you can hear the difference now. If I take this, play it. So here's console channel, purest console, old version. All those random numbers are the same for each channel, whereas this one, now I'm just giving you a hard time. These are dithering to floating point. No, you're not hearing a different random number on every channel, but it is doing it. And there are some useful benefits to picking up on that one. It turned out to be a really good suggestion. Somebody on, I think, Gearsluts pointed out, hey, these random numbers are going to be the same for the different things, and maybe they can all be different. And that gives me some useful tools going forwards for doing further things. But my point being with this, and let me put it back to my 0.72. Using this new technique, even though I've got things set up with a gain factor, actually not that one was unity gain. Even though I've got these things set up where here is my new drum kit, for instance. If this sounds like a cool drum kit, it's because it's the same drum kit that I had before, but it might sound a little better than on the previous recording, because it is, on the one hand, new microphones. They are more of those Roswell Mini K47s. People told me about those. I got to swear by them. They're excellent. But the other part of it is that these are now Bonham-style secret weapon drums, in that they may not be Ludwigs, they are Gretches, but the insides of all of them are lined with aluminum foil. And that does not make them rattle or rumble. What it does is it makes them damped. And yes, even the snare is filled with aluminum foil, or lined with aluminum foil. I can take out the room sound there. But I was talking about manipulating these things. Suppose I was to open the settings for these things, and I might as well also open up like our left and right channels while we're at it. And we'll listen to just that, maybe throw on the it's a slightly less weird thing than the bass, which plays very strange stuff. And now that we're listening to mostly, well, I say mostly, the whole point of this is that we can balance it in interesting ways. So we'll pull this back a little bit. We'll pull the Rhodes back a little bit. All this is on the actual Console7. Let's pull the room back. Let's push the kick forward some. And it's not perfectly balanced, so let's scooch it this way, just so that we can have it a little stereo balanced. And in so doing, we're manipulating the saturation curves of every single one of these tracks so that we can kind of sculpt them. So rather than just turning the kick drum up for something like that, we're turning it up, but we're also saturating it. And so that kick drum mic is way more forward than it was. But we could also sit it way back, at which point it sounds like we barely have kick at all. Or we can make the room way louder. And all of this is without fooling around with any of the actual timings between tracks. All this forward and back stuff, this manipulation of the sound. Like, you know, kick forward, room back, kick way forwards, kick farther back, room more forwards. Let's see. Guitar way forwards. Guitar way back. And then finally a nice little fade off of everything. All of this is just done using Console7's ability to manipulate the sort of saturation curve of everything. And it's doing that trick that I was talking about, where as you're manipulating the gain levels of things, rather than just acting as a simple fader, and I can also go in and, here, let's This one defaults to 0 or 1, so I should be able to also demonstrate the other opposite factor, which is that you get the reverse effect from using the actual fader in the DAW, because this DAW doesn't let you do post-fader plugins. If it did, you could do Console as a post-fader plugin, but you'd still be better off using the control on Console. Let's hide this rhythm guitar and go to just the drum sound. Grab the kick. Now that room level is about the same as you'd want, but rather than have the room dominate like this or fall back, if I do it on the fader, it sits back when being boosted, or sort of scooches forwards a little bit when being muted. And this is not useful, so what we'll do is use the one on the fader, and it tries to come forwards a little bit when being boosted. And sits back when being cut. So there you have it. I mean, this is all a little unorthodox, I'll grant you that. And that's pretty typical for my stuff, but there's a lot going into this one. And I hope that you like it. Let me get my little screen back there. So Console7 is your usual Airwindows plugin set, which is audio unit and Mac, PC, and Linux VST. Also open source, so if anybody desperately wants it ported to something like that, well, find somebody who can do that, and it should be fairly straightforward to do. It's supported by Patreon, which is why I'm still here able to push forwards the capacities of Console. In using it, I would encourage using it with, for instance, if you have a fader bank, even something as simple as like a nano control or something like that. That's a good way to do this type of thing. It ought to be able to handle that stuff really nicely. You can move the faders around, including with automation or with a hardware control surface, and the software will smooth out variations for you, so it'll handle stuff, but you're not going to get any zipper noise. It'll be nice and clean. And yeah, this is the latest version of Console. It's been a little while since I've had one of these come out. It's essentially the discovery of the things I learned with ultrasonic. And the idea here, I don't think you should have to put instances of the ultrasonic plugin all over your mix. I don't think it's necessary to be that extreme with it, to do a 10th order filter between everything and everything. I also don't think it's useful to just put a 10th order filter on the beginning of your stuff and then settle for that. Have only the one on input and then do the entire mixing system, because at that point, every new nonlinear processing that you get incurs its own, it aggravates the situation as far as aliasing is concerned, especially if you're doing stuff in a high sample rate, which I recommend, like 96K. If you saturate enough that you're generating harmonics up at a 96K sampling rate, and you do them high enough, they might be quieter, but they'll probably still be there, and if they reflect back, and then you saturate again, the slight aliasing that you had is now something that gets fed into the new processing and generates more aliasing that's even weirder and more wrong. So theoretically what you want to do is obliterate all the high frequencies between every single stage. That's somewhat inconvenient. And if you were using, say, ultrasonic, it would require a whole bunch of processing. But using Console7, and you can still throw an instance of ultrasonic on it if there's something that is particularly problematic. But I don't think you're going to run into a lot of that. Because when you do linear saturation curves, or saturation curves that are pretty close to linear, that's not a sharp edge, not a sharp clip, you generate harmonics and aliasing and stuff more gradually. And running a simple biquad filter between every stage, like Console7 does, goes a long, long way. So there you have it. Console7 is my new plugin, or set of plugins. The way it operates is basically like all the other ones, except for with this one, using the control marked fader on it, or using the master for the master volume, should act, feel, and sound like using an analog console where you're running into saturation curves on the console that clip and saturate in a particularly nice way. Therefore, you can push the whole system, or you can pull stuff back, and it should just cooperate with you. It should just work and give you a mix that falls into place more easily than they usually do in the digital audio workstation. That's the idea. So I hope you like it. Put a bunch of work into it over the last week or so. I probably should try to use or do yet another jam, because the jam that I did for this one was really pretty flaky and strange. I got bored of the previous recording. And it's kind of inspiring using the new microphones. Those have been sitting around for ages, and I've been too busy working on plugins to be able to do anything with them. But now that I have, it's like, yeah, it sounds like this is something that I can do. And we'll see what else transpires. For now, I have been Christopher from Airwindows, and I'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.